June 9th, 62. Anno Domini, the island of Pandateria. The air is the first thing one notices, a thick, suffocating blanket of salt and sulfur, clinging to the skin like a shroud. It is the breath of the volcano that birthed this jagged black rock, a place where the Roman world sends its unwanted, its inconvenient, its living ghosts. The waves of the Tyrrhenian Sea do not lap at the shore. They smash against it with a relentless, percussive fury, a sound that has become the only calendar for the island's solitary, royal prisoner. Today, however, a new sound cuts through the roar of the surf, the crunch of hobnailed boots on volcanic gravel. A cohort of soldiers has arrived, their armor dulled by sea spray, their faces grimly impassive. They are not the polished Praetorians of the Palatine. They are rough men, executioners sent to perform a task. They find her in the modest villa, a woman who is barely that, a girl of 22 years whose eyes hold the ancient terror of a dynasty that has always devoured its own. This is Claudia Octavia, daughter of the deified Emperor Claudius, great-granddaughter of the divine Augustus, wife of the Emperor Nero. She is not dressed in the silks of an empress, but in the simple, drab tunic of an exile. When the centurion unrolls the scroll and reads the order, the words are almost lost to the wind, but their meaning is absolute. The charge is treason. The sentence is death. A strangled gasp escapes her lips, the last gasp of a hope she didn't even know she had. She does not stand with stoic defiance. She collapses, pleading, invoking the names of her divine ancestors, her brother Britannicus, her status as Nero's wife. Her voice, once the calm and dignified whisper of the imperial court, is now a thin, desperate wail that the soldiers ignore. They bind her arms, and the cold metal of the manacles is a shocking, final reality. The physician, a trembling Greek, opens the veins in her arms with a clumsy hand. The pain is a distant fire, but her blood, chilled by abject terror, refuses to flow. It pools, thick and sluggish, a pathetic, dark mockery of a noble Roman suicide. The centurion, impatient and contemptuous, orders them to take her to the bathhouse. They drag her, slipping on the wet stones, into a small chamber filled with steam so hot it sears the lungs. The world dissolves into a blinding white vapor, the roar of the sea replaced by the roar in her own ears. It is here, in this suffocating, hellish heat, that the last direct descendant of Augustus is held down and suffocated, a squalid and ignominious end to a life lived entirely as a symbol. This was the final, brutal act in the saga of her destruction. To comprehend how the purest woman in Rome, the beloved of its people, could be so methodically and cruelly erased, we must return to the world that both forged her as an icon and damned her for that very purity. This is the narrative of her, Claudia Octavia, the silent empress whose virtue became her death sentence. Her story poses the most agonizing of questions. How did this happen? How did the daughter of one emperor and the wife of another, a woman protected by the blood of Augustus and the love of the Roman people, become a piece of human refuse to be disposed of on a barren rock? The answer is not a simple tale of political intrigue. It is a deep, psychological horror story about the nature of absolute power and the corrosive effect of a monstrous ego upon an entire world. Her tragedy was not an accident of history, but the inevitable, calculated outcome of a clash between two irreconcilable forces. The stoic, quiet dignity of the old Roman ideal she embodied, and the narcissistic, theatrical madness of the new age personified by her husband, Nero. To understand her fall, we must understand that she was never truly a person in the eyes of those who controlled her fate. From the moment of her birth, she was a symbol, a vessel for the ambitions and legitimacy of others. Her body was a political territory, her womb a potential cradle for emperors, and her public image a cornerstone of the state's stability. She was sacrificed not for what she did, but for what she was. Her very existence was a silent, unbearable judgment upon a regime that was spiraling into a depraved parody of imperial power. Nero's actions were not driven by political necessity, but by a deeply personal and pathological need to destroy the mirror that she held up to him, a mirror that showed him not the god artist he believed himself to be, but a grotesque and insecure tyrant. The story of her undoing is therefore the story of how a man's love for himself became a force so destructive it had to annihilate the one person the rest of the world genuinely loved. We must peel back the layers of Roman propaganda, the accounts of fawning historians and later detractors, to find the terrifying truth of her final years. She was a prisoner in her own palace, an empress in name only, slowly and systematically being stripped of her humanity before she was stripped of her life, all to satisfy the whims of a husband whose love was the most lethal poison of all. To understand the fate of Claudia Octavia, we must first return to the world of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, a world that was less a stable empire and more a gilded cage lined with vipers. By the middle of the 1st century, the Roman Empire was a global colossus, its legions holding a domain that stretched from the mists of Britain to the sands of Syria. Yet its political heart on the Palatine Hill in Rome was a place of deep and festering sickness. The system created by Augustus, a delicate balance of republican facade and monarchical reality, had decayed under his successors into a barely concealed despotism, fueled by paranoia and lubricated by blood. This was a world where power was not wielded in the Senate House, but whispered into the emperor's ear in the dead of night by ambitious freedmen, scheming courtiers, and powerful women of the imperial household. The true battlefield was not on the German frontier, but in the corridors of the palace and at the imperial dinner table, where a cup of wine could be a death sentence. The ghosts of the past hung heavy in the air, the ghost of Augustus, whose impossible standard of leadership no one could meet, the ghost of Tiberius, who retreated into paranoid seclusion, the ghost of the mad Caligula, whose reign proved that the emperor's whim was now divine law, and the ghost of Claudius, Octavia's own father, a seemingly bumbling scholar who had survived by playing the fool, only to rule an empire through his powerful and often corrupt secretaries and wives. In this treacherous ecosystem, loyalty was a fleeting commodity, and family was the most dangerous enemy of all. Brothers murdered brothers, wives poisoned husbands, and mothers schemed to place their sons on the throne, only to be murdered by those very sons. Octavia was born into the very epicenter of this decay, a world that had forgotten the meaning of the virtues it still publicly preached, a place where the lives of the highest born were the most precarious of all. Her world was a grand, terrifying theater of cruelty, and from her earliest days, she was being groomed for a starring and ultimately sacrificial role. Her character, a study in quiet resilience and profound fear, was forged in the crucible of a terrifying childhood. She was the daughter of the Emperor Claudius, but more significantly, she was the daughter of Valeria Messalina, a woman whose name would become a byword for sexual depravity and political treason for all of history. While her mother engaged in scandalous affairs and allegedly even worked as a prostitute in a brothel for a thrill, the young Octavia was raised in the suffocating formality of the imperial court, a silent witness to a world of whispers and sudden disappearances. The defining trauma of her youth came in the year 48, when she was just a child. Messalina, in an act of stunning recklessness, bigamously married her lover, Gaius Silius, while Claudius was away from Rome. The plot was discovered, and the emperor's wrath, when finally roused, was terrible. Messalina was executed, along with dozens of her associates. Imagine the world of a young girl seeing her mother, the empress, suddenly declared an enemy of the state, her name chiseled off monuments, her very existence cursed. This event taught Octavia a brutal, unforgettable lesson, that even the highest position offered no protection, that passion was dangerous, and that survival lay in silence, obedience, and invisibility. She learned to be the antithesis of her mother, pious, modest, and utterly self-effacing. But the chaos was not over. After Messalina's execution, Claudius married his niece, Agrippina the Younger, a woman of formidable ambition and ruthless intelligence. Agrippina brought with her a son from a previous marriage, the young Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus. From the moment Agrippina entered the palace, Octavia's life was no longer her own. She was no longer just the emperor's daughter. She became Agrippina's most valuable pawn in a deadly game for the throne, her quiet existence now irrevocably bound to the fate of Agrippina's monstrous son. The first step into the great and terrible game of imperial politics was taken not by Octavia herself, but for her when she was still a girl. Her fate was sealed by the ambitions of her new stepmother, Agrippina. To solidify her son's position and sideline Claudius's own son, Britannicus, Agrippina orchestrated a masterful political maneuver. She would have Octavia betrothed to her son, Lucius Domitius. This was a union that was both politically brilliant and personally monstrous. To make it happen, Agrippina first had to break Octavia's existing betrothal to Lucius Junius Silanus Torquatus, a distinguished nobleman and a descendant of Augustus himself. A trumped-up charge of incest was leveled against Silanus and his sister, a slander so transparently false that it shocked even the jaded Roman elite. The charge was enough. Silanus was forced to commit suicide on the very day of Claudius and Agrippina's wedding, a dark omen of the ruthlessness that now governed the imperial house. With her previous fiancé dead, the path was clear. Octavia, a young girl still reeling from the execution of her mother and the disgrace of her family, was formally betrothed to her cousin, the boy who would soon be adopted by Claudius and renamed Nero, Claudius Caesar, Drusus Germanicus. Their marriage, celebrated in the year 53, was the capstone of Agrippina's grand strategy. It united the bloodline of Claudius with the ambitious line of the Domitii Ahenobarbi, giving Nero a claim to the throne that was now, through his wife, directly linked to the divine Augustus. For Octavia, this marriage was not a union of love or even companionship. It was a political sentence. She was being handed over to a boy known for his volatile temper and strange passions, a boy whose ambition was being stoked daily by a mother who would stop at nothing to see him rule. She was the unwilling bride, a silent, beautiful prop in a ceremony that celebrated not her happiness, but her strategic value. This marriage placed her at the very center of the viper's nest, binding her for life to the two people who would ultimately be responsible for her destruction. The inner motivations of Claudia Octavia and her husband Nero were a study in absolute, catastrophic opposition. They were two celestial bodies, locked in a gravitational pull, one a cold, distant star of tradition, the other a blazing, self-immolating comet of rebellion. Octavia's secret motivation, her driving force, was not a desire for power, for which she had no appetite, but a desperate, all-consuming need for survival, pursued through the only means she knew: a rigid adherence to the ancient Roman virtues. Having witnessed her mother's ruin through excess, Octavia constructed her entire identity around pudicitia, modesty, gravitas, dignity, and pietas, duty. She believed, perhaps naively, that if she was the perfect Roman matron, the flawless empress, she would be unassailable. Her virtue was her armor, her piety, her shield. She did not seek to rule, but to endure, to weather the storm of her husband's temperament and her mother-in-law's machinations by being so impeccably correct that no one could find fault with her. This was her tragic miscalculation. She failed to understand that in the new world Nero was creating, her virtues were not an asset, but a provocation. Nero's inner demon was the precise inverse of her guiding principle. He was a man possessed by a pathological need to transgress, to shatter every taboo, to escape the suffocating weight of the very traditions his wife embodied. He despised the constraints of his imperial role, the endless state meetings, the feigned respect for the Senate. He saw himself not as an emperor, but as a supreme artist, a poet, a singer, a charioteer, whose genius was being stifled by the drab, moralizing world of the Roman elite. Octavia, in her quiet, unimpeachable dignity, was the living symbol of that world. Every time he looked at her, he saw the face of the establishment that bored and constrained him. He did not want a dignified empress. He wanted a rapturous audience. He did not desire a pious wife. He craved a decadent accomplice. Her refusal or inability to be anything other than what she was, a good and virtuous Roman woman, slowly transformed his indifference into a cold, simmering hatred. Her very existence was an obstacle to the realization of his artistic, unrestrained self, and it was an obstacle he would eventually have to remove. Octavia's life was tragically defined by her relationship with the two dominant figures who controlled the nexus of power in Rome: her mother-in-law, Agrippina the Younger, and her husband, the Emperor Nero. This was not a simple triangle of palace intrigue. It was a complex and deadly symbiosis between a master manipulator, a burgeoning monster, and a virtuous pawn. Agrippina was, for a time, Octavia's most powerful protector. It was Agrippina who had engineered the marriage, who had placed Nero on the throne after the convenient death of Claudius, and who understood that Octavia's lineage from Augustus was the sacred thread that gave Nero's rule its veneer of legitimacy. In the early years of the reign, Agrippina fiercely guarded Octavia's position as empress, not out of any affection for the girl, but because Octavia was indispensable to her own power. As long as Octavia was Nero's wife, Agrippina, as the mother of the emperor and the mother-in-law of the Augustan descendant, remained the true power behind the throne. She saw Octavia as a crucial piece on the chessboard, the queen, who, while having limited moves of her own, protected the king simply by being on the board. However, this protection was a poisoned gift. It meant that Octavia was inextricably linked to Agrippina's overbearing influence, an influence that Nero soon came to resent with a murderous passion. The true monster in her life was, of course, her husband. From the very beginning, Nero's feelings for Octavia were a mixture of cold indifference and veiled contempt. Tacitus notes that he found her modest and quiet nature uninteresting, his passions drawn to more libertine figures, first the freedwoman Claudia Octavia, and later the ambitious Poppaea Sabina. He tolerated Octavia because his mother and his advisors, Seneca and Burrus, insisted upon it. She was a political necessity, a living embodiment of the tradition he was expected to uphold. But as his confidence grew and his desire to break free from his mother's control intensified, his view of Octavia began to shift. She was no longer just a boring wife. She was a symbol of his mother's control, a representative of the old guard, a constant silent reminder of the duties he despised. The fateful encounter was not a single meeting, but the daily, suffocating reality of her marriage, a marriage that placed her directly between a mother who used her as a shield and a son who saw her as part of the cage he had to destroy. In the first years of Nero's reign, the so-called Quinquennium Neronis, Octavia fulfilled her role as empress with a flawless, if melancholic, grace. While the reins of government were ably handled by the philosopher Seneca and the praetorian prefect Burrus, and Nero indulged his artistic passions in private, Octavia was the serene, dignified face of the imperial family. She was the empress in the shadows, a constant presence in public ceremonies, her image stamped on coins alongside her husband's, a symbol of stability and dynastic continuity. This was the price of power for Nero. To be accepted as emperor, he needed her by his side. Her bloodline, tracing back to the deified Augustus, was the ultimate seal of approval, a sacred blessing on his rule, which was, in reality, secured by the murder of her father Claudius and the disinheritance of her brother Britannicus. The people of Rome, who held a deep and almost religious reverence for the Julio-Claudian house, adored her. They saw in her the ideal Roman woman, pious, modest, and loyal. Her public appearances were met with genuine affection, a stark contrast to the mixture of fear and fascination that Nero was beginning to inspire. Yet, in the private chambers of the palace, she was utterly alone. Nero made no secret of his lack of affection for her. He had his mistresses, and his true emotional life was lived entirely outside their marriage bed. Octavia was left to preside over a household that was not her own, surrounded by her husband's favorites and her mother-in-law's spies. Her position was a paradox. She was the most powerful woman in the Roman world, yet she was personally powerless. She was a revered icon whose opinions were worthless, an empress whose husband didn't desire her. This quiet dignity, this perfect performance of her role, was a silent reproach to Nero's own inclinations. As he grew more confident in his power and more eager to shed the moral and political restraints imposed upon him by Seneca, Burrus, and his mother, Octavia's impeccable virtue began to look less like an asset and more like an accusation. She was the living embodiment of the traditions he was itching to desecrate, and the price of his power was becoming a burden he was no longer willing to bear. The primary antagonist in Octavia's story was not a rival empire or a usurping general on the frontiers. It was a force far more insidious and impossible to fight. The antagonist was the enemy within, the creeping moral and psychological decay of the imperial court itself, a cultural revolution championed and personified by Nero. This was a war not of swords and shields, but of values. Octavia, by her very nature, represented the old Rome, the Rome of stoic duty, public decorum, and ancestral tradition. She was a living link to the Augustan ideal of the imperial family as the moral center of the state. The new world being born in Nero's court was its monstrous antithesis. It was a world that valued artistic expression above civic duty, sensual pleasure above self-restraint, and theatrical spectacle above political gravitas. Nero did not want to be an emperor in the mold of Augustus. He wanted to be a Hellenistic artist king, a god of the stage, adored for his voice and his lyre, not for his justice or military prowess. This new culture began to permeate the palace. The sober functions of state were replaced by extravagant parties that lasted for days. Roman nobles were encouraged to disgrace themselves by performing on stage alongside the emperor. The air grew thick with the influence of figures who catered to Nero's worst instincts, men like the Sybaritic Petronius, and later, the ruthless and ambitious Praetorian prefect Tigellinus. In this new moral landscape, Octavia's virtues were transformed into crimes. Her modesty was seen as coldness, her dignity as arrogance, her piety as a silent judgment on their revels. She was a ghost of the Republic haunting a debauched Eastern monarchy. The macro-level threat to her was this inexorable cultural shift, a tide of decadence that was washing away the foundations of her world. She could not fight it because it was formless. It was a change in the very air they breathed. Every public performance by Nero, every extravagant banquet, every honor given to a flamboyant actor or charioteer was another blow against the world she represented. She was the symbol of a past that her husband was determined to obliterate. And as his revolution against tradition gained momentum, it became terrifyingly clear that its first and most important victim would have to be her. The moment the mask of civility was irrevocably torn away, revealing the true face of the monster she had married, came during a dinner at the palace in the year 55. It was a night that would be seared into Octavia's memory as the psychological breaking point from which there was no return. The victim was her younger brother, Britannicus, the true son of the deified Claudius and the last, most potent rival to Nero's throne. Though only a teenager, Britannicus was a living reminder that Nero was an adopted impostor. As he approached his 14th birthday, the age of manhood in Rome, Agrippina, in her escalating power struggles with her son, had begun to champion Britannicus's cause, a threat Nero could not tolerate. The method of his elimination was a masterpiece of cold, calculated cruelty, performed for all the court to see. During the banquet, a special cup of wine, tasted beforehand by a servant, was brought to Britannicus. It was served hot, and when he complained of the temperature, cold water was added. That water was laced with a poison so swift and potent that the boy collapsed instantly, gasping for breath, the life draining from his body within seconds. A horrified silence fell over the dining room. Some guests fled in terror, while others, more cunning, stared at Nero, their faces a perfect blank, feigning ignorance. Tacitus paints a chilling picture of the scene. Octavia, despite her youth and her practiced control, could not hide her terror and grief. She understood instantly what had happened. She had just witnessed her husband murder her brother before her very eyes. Nero, meanwhile, coolly remarked that the boy was merely having one of his epileptic fits and that he would soon recover. He then reclined back on his couch and continued with his meal. In that single, horrifying moment, Octavia's world shattered. Any lingering girlish hope for a peaceful existence, any belief that her position offered her some measure of safety, was annihilated. She now knew, with absolute certainty, that she was married to a creature devoid of human empathy, a monster who would eliminate anyone who stood in his way, including the last members of her own family. From that night on, she was no longer just an unloved wife. She was a terrified hostage, living in the shadow of a killer. The murder of Britannicus was the first tremor, but the earthquake that completely shattered the political landscape and left Octavia terrifyingly exposed was Nero's matricide in the year 59. The power struggle between Nero and his mother, Agrippina, had reached its zenith. Agrippina, who had clawed her way to the heights of power and placed her son on the throne, refused to relinquish control. She interfered in state affairs, criticized his affair with Poppaea Sabina, and constantly reminded him that he owed her everything. For Nero, her very presence was a suffocating reminder of his own initial powerlessness. He resolved to kill her, and the chaos that ensued provided him with the ultimate opportunity to seize absolute, untethered power. His first attempt was a piece of bizarre, theatrical villainy, a specially designed collapsible boat that was meant to sink in the Bay of Naples, making her death look like an accident. Miraculously, Agrippina survived the shipwreck and swam to shore. Realizing her son was trying to murder her, she sent a messenger to inform him of her survival, a desperate gambit to feign ignorance. Nero, panicking, saw no other option but brute force. He turned to his former tutor, Innocence, now the prefect of the fleet, a man who held a personal grudge against Agrippina. Innocence and his soldiers surrounded Agrippina's villa. In her final moments, she faced her assassins with defiance, baring her womb and shouting, "Strike here!" a grim acknowledgement that the son she had brought into the world was now ending hers. The murder of a mother by her son was a crime that horrified even the cynical Roman world. Yet, after a brief period of fear, Nero discovered something liberating. He got away with it. After a carefully orchestrated campaign of propaganda that painted Agrippina as a traitor, the Senate congratulated him on his survival. This was the moment Nero was truly born. The murder of his mother was his psychological liberation. He had broken the ultimate taboo and faced no consequences. With Seneca and Burrus's influence waning and his mother gone, the last major restraint on his power was removed. For Octavia, this was a catastrophe. Agrippina, for all her faults, had been her protector, the one person who insisted on the sanctity of her marriage to Nero. With Agrippina dead, no one was left to stand between Octavia and the whims of a husband who was now an unchecked, matricidal god-emperor. The chaos of his crime had cleared the board of his most powerful opponent, leaving his gentle, virtuous wife as the next, most obvious symbol of the old order that had to be destroyed. Nero's first official attempt to cast Octavia aside in favor of his pregnant mistress, Poppaea Sabina, led to the single greatest and most dangerous triumph of Octavia's life. In the year 62, confident in his absolute power, Nero divorced Octavia, citing her alleged sterility as the cause. He immediately married Poppaea just 12 days later. He had miscalculated badly. He had failed to account for the deep and genuine affection the people of Rome held for the daughter of Claudius. The news of the divorce and the elevation of the unpopular Poppaea sparked outrage in the city. What began as murmurs of disapproval quickly erupted into mass public demonstrations. Crowds surged through the streets, not in a violent insurrection, but in a spontaneous and passionate display of loyalty to their wronged empress. They openly praised Octavia, carrying her statues, adorned with flowers, aloft as if in a religious procession. In their anger, they sought out the statues of the new empress, Poppaea, and smashed them to the ground, pulling them down from public buildings and dragging them through the mud. The riots grew so large that the mob even swarmed the Palatine Hill, their cheers for Octavia echoing through the halls of the very palace where she was now a prisoner. This was her greatest triumph, a moment when the will of the people rose up to defend her honor against the will of their emperor. For a brief, intoxicating moment, it seemed as if popular opinion could reverse an imperial decree. Nero, terrified by the scale of the unrest, was forced to back down. In a stunning reversal, he appeared to capitulate, publicly announcing that he would take Octavia back as his wife. The city celebrated, believing they had won, believing their love had saved their empress. This was the peak of her power, a power she never sought and did not know how to wield, a triumph delivered not by political maneuvering, but by the raw emotion of the Roman street. For Claudia Octavia, the triumph of the people's support was not a moment of vindication, but one of pure, unadulterated terror. As she heard the roar of the crowd from within the palace, chanting her name and destroying the images of her rival, she did not feel saved. She felt doomed. She, who had built her entire life around the principle of quiet invisibility, had just been made the center of the most public spectacle in Rome. She understood the mind of her husband better than the cheering crowds did. She knew that this popular uprising would not be seen by Nero as a sign of her innocence, or a reason to cherish her, but as the ultimate act of defiance. The people had chosen her over him. They had dared to dictate the emperor's choice of wife. In the pathologically narcissistic worldview of Nero, this was not just a political problem, it was a profound, personal humiliation, an artistic critique of his life's performance. He, the divine artist, the master of his own destiny, had been publicly shamed by the love the common people felt for his drab, sterile wife. Octavia knew that from that moment on, she was no longer just an unwanted spouse. She was a political rival, a rallying point for all discontent against his reign. The people's love had not woven her a crown. It had placed a crown of thorns upon her head. For Nero, this moment was one of supreme hubris, followed by incandescent rage. He had believed himself to be a beloved populist ruler, yet the plebs had shown they loved the symbol of old-fashioned virtue more than his new world of artistic liberation. His capitulation was purely tactical. Behind the scenes, the humiliation festered, turning into a cold, murderous resolve. He had been made to look weak, and he would never forgive her for it. Poppaea, too, now had the ultimate weapon. She could whisper in his ear that as long as Octavia lived, she would always be a threat, a living icon for his enemies. The psychology of this triumph was therefore utterly perverse. The very act that demonstrated Octavia's power was the one that sealed her fate and guaranteed her destruction. The sworn enemy, the architect of Octavia's final ruin, was a woman who was her perfect and terrifying opposite, Poppaea Sabina. Where Octavia was modest, Poppaea was brazen. Where Octavia was pious, Poppaea was decadent. Where Octavia relied on her lineage and virtue, Poppaea wielded her beauty, intelligence, and sexuality as devastating political weapons. She was, according to Tacitus, a woman who had everything else except an honest mind. She hailed from a noble but slightly scandalous background and had been married twice before, most recently to Marcus Salvius Otho, one of Nero's closest companions in debauchery. It was through Otho that she met the emperor, and from that moment, she began a campaign to conquer him. She was not merely a passive mistress, she was an active and brilliant political operator. She understood Nero's psychology perfectly. She played upon his vanity, praising his artistic talents in a way the stoic Octavia never could. She inflamed his desire by alternating between seduction and strategic withdrawal, famously telling him she could not fully be his as long as she was just a mistress and he was tied to another woman. Poppaea was the living embodiment of the new, decadent world Nero wished to create. She was witty, extravagant, and utterly immoral. Their personal drama was the clash of two archetypes, the chaste Roman matron versus the sophisticated, seductive courtesan queen. Poppaea saw Octavia not just as a rival for a man's affection, but as a political obstacle. As long as Octavia was empress, Poppaea was merely a consort, and any child she bore Nero might be deemed illegitimate. Her ambition was absolute. She wanted the title, the power, and the security of being the official empress of Rome. She constantly whispered poison in Nero's ear, mocking Octavia's plainness, ridiculing her as a cold and barren woman, and most effectively, stoking his paranoia. After the riots in Octavia's favor, Poppaea's arguments became deadly. She painted Octavia as a dangerous political threat, the leader of a virtual opposition party whose popularity with the masses and the old nobility made her a constant danger to his throne. She was the driving force, the catalyst that turned Nero's passive dislike for his wife into an active, murderous conspiracy. While Nero was busy remaking the Roman state into his personal theater, Octavia's contribution to the empire, her construction, was of a different, more subtle, and ultimately more dangerous kind. She did not pass laws or command armies. Her labor was the constant, draining, and unseen work of maintaining the moral and social facade of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. In an era of escalating scandal, she was the sole remaining symbol of traditional Roman stability. Her every public act was a piece of construction, a careful reinforcement of the imperial ideal that her husband was so busy dismantling. When she appeared at religious ceremonies, her head veiled in the manner of a pious matron, she was rebuilding the connection between the imperial house and the gods of Rome. When she engaged in charitable acts, distributing largesse to the common people, she was reinforcing the image of the empress as the mother of the nation. When she received the wives of senators with quiet grace and dignity, she was shoring up the crumbling relationship between the palace and the aristocracy. This was an immense and unrewarded political service. In the early years, her presence helped to legitimize Nero's rule, calming the fears of traditionalists who were alarmed by the young emperor's proclivities. She was, in effect, the empire's living mask of respectability. However, as Nero's reign progressed and his behavior became more erratic, her constructive role became a destructive one for her personally. Her impeccable conduct was no longer a support for his regime, but a glaring contrast to it. Her quiet dignity made his theatrical excesses look all the more ridiculous. Her popularity with the people, earned through her diligent performance of these traditional duties, became a source of intense jealousy and paranoia for him. The very state she was working to preserve, or at least appear to preserve, was becoming openly hostile to the virtues she represented. Her unseen labor was the foundation of the public's love for her, but it was also the foundation of her husband's lethal resentment. She was building her own pyre with every act of virtue. The court of Nero was a complex ecosystem of competing influences, a world of whispers and poison, where Octavia was almost completely isolated. The onions and vegetables that gave flavor to her tragedy were the secondary characters who controlled the levers of power and shaped the environment around her. For a time, her position was buffered by the two great ministers of the early reign, the philosopher Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Sextus Afranius Burrus. They were pragmatic men who, while indulging Nero's private passions, understood the necessity of maintaining public order and the appearance of traditional governance. They saw Octavia as essential to this project. They consistently advised Nero against divorcing her, knowing it would destabilize his relationship with the Senate and the people. But their influence was finite. Burrus died in the year 62, possibly from poison, removing a crucial voice of military and moral authority. Seneca, seeing his influence wane, began a slow retreat from public life. Their departure created a power vacuum, which was eagerly filled by a new breed of courtier who rose to prominence not through merit, but through their willingness to pander to Nero's darkest impulses. The most significant of these was Ophonius Tigellinus, a man of low birth who had been exiled for adultery with Nero's own sisters. Tigellinus returned to become the emperor's co-commander of the Praetorian Guard and his master of depravity. He was cruel, cunning, and completely devoid of principles. Tigellinus became Nero's chief enabler, encouraging his paranoia and actively working to destroy anyone who represented the old guard. Another key figure was the freedman Anicetus, Nero's childhood tutor and now prefect of the fleet at Misenum. It was Anicetus who had designed the collapsible boat for Agrippina's murder, and who would later play a despicable role in Octavia's final destruction. Surrounded by men like these, and with Poppaea constantly at Nero's side, Octavia had no allies. Her household was filled with spies. Her every movement was watched. The very air in the palace was hostile, a suffocating mixture of fear, flattery, and conspiracy, and she was breathing it alone. The first cracks in the foundation of Octavia's precarious existence began to appear long before the final earthquake of her divorce and exile. These were the harbingers of the storm, the ominous portents that signaled her husband's growing impatience with the constraints of their marriage. The first and most public sign was Nero's affair with Poppaea Sabina, which he ceased to hide. She was moved into the palace, and her influence over the emperor became an open secret, a daily humiliation for the legitimate empress. Then came the whispers, the carefully planted rumors designed to erode her reputation for unimpeachable virtue. Stories began to circulate, likely originating from Poppaea's circle, that the empress was having an affair. These were initially dismissed as absurd, for Octavia's life was one of near monastic seclusion and public piety. But the mud was meant to stick, to create a pretext, however flimsy. The most significant harbinger was the legal and political weaponization of her childlessness. After years of marriage, Octavia had not produced an heir. In a dynastic system, a barren empress was a political liability. This fact, which had once been a private sorrow, was now being transformed into a public crime. The charge of sterility was the perfect weapon. It was a cold, clinical accusation that carried an air of legitimacy. It allowed Nero to frame his desire for a divorce not as the whim of a lecherous husband, but as an act of state, a responsible emperor's duty to secure the succession. When Poppaea became pregnant in 62, the storm broke. The final pretext was in place. Nero now had the reason he needed to act. The first official steps were taken, and the machinery of the state began to turn against its empress. The divorce proceedings were initiated, a cold and formal process that stripped away the legal foundations of her status, leaving her exposed and vulnerable to the far more sinister attacks that were to follow. The fateful act that triggered the finale was Nero's cold, calculated decision to divorce Octavia. The psychology behind this move was not one of passionate error, but of supreme, arrogant calculation. With Poppaea pregnant, Nero believed he had the perfect, unassailable justification. He would cast aside the barren wife for the fertile one, an act any Roman could understand as a matter of dynastic necessity. He saw this not as a personal betrayal, but as an imperial prerogative. In his mind, he was no longer a mere man bound by conventional morality. He was the state, and his desires were synonymous with the needs of the empire. He had murdered his mother and been praised for it. He had disgraced his station by performing on stage and been applauded. He had come to believe in his own invincibility, in his power to reshape reality according to his will. If he declared Octavia sterile and divorced her, then that would become the truth. He fatally underestimated the symbolic power she held in the hearts of the people, an emotional connection that could not be erased by legal decree. The divorce, announced on the grounds of sterility, was a brutal public humiliation for Octavia. It was a declaration that her entire existence as empress, her primary function, had been a failure. She was summarily dismissed, her place taken by her rival. But when the people rioted in her favor, Nero's calculation turned to fury. His fateful act had backfired spectacularly, revealing the limits of his power. This forced him to escalate. The error was not in divorcing her, but in believing it would be easy. The public backlash transformed a political maneuver into a desperate struggle for dominance. He could not afford to look weak. He could not allow the people to believe they had defeated him. And so, the initial, relatively clean legal act of divorce had to be followed by something far filthier, a campaign of character assassination so vile it would destroy her reputation and justify any cruelty he chose to inflict upon her. The psychology of the error was one of supreme narcissism. When his reality was challenged, he did not question his actions. he decided to destroy the person who was the source of that challenge. The greatest catastrophe, the moment of Octavia's complete and irreversible moral and political destruction, was not her death, but the grotesque show trial that preceded it. After the riots forced Nero to pretend to take her back, he and his cronies concocted a new plan. A simple divorce was no longer enough. Her reputation had to be annihilated so that no one would dare to defend her again. The charge was escalated from sterility to high treason, specifically adultery with the intent to overthrow the emperor. The man chosen to be her alleged lover was Anicetus, the prefect of the fleet. This choice was a stroke of diabolical genius. Anicetus was the man who had murdered Nero's mother. By naming him, Nero was creating a narrative so perverse it defied logic. His virtuous, pious wife was supposedly having an affair with his mother's killer. It was a charge designed not to be credible, but to be shocking and defiling. At first, Anicetus, perhaps holding some last shred of honor, denied the accusation. But under pressure from Nero, who likely offered him a comfortable exile in exchange for his testimony, he confessed to everything. The next step was to coerce testimony from Octavia's own household slaves. Her handmaidens were arrested and brutally tortured to force them to incriminate their mistress. Most of them, in a remarkable display of courage, maintained Octavia's innocence even under extreme duress. One of them famously screamed at the interrogator, Tigellinus, that Octavia's private parts were cleaner than his mouth. But torture, when applied relentlessly, will always produce the desired result. A few broken slaves finally confessed. With these coerced statements and Anicetus's false testimony, Nero had what he needed. A trial was convened, but it was a mere formality. The evidence was presented. The verdict was preordained. Claudia Octavia, the daughter of an emperor, was declared guilty of treason. This was the ultimate catastrophe. It was the state-sanctioned murder of her honor, a public branding of the purest woman in Rome as a depraved traitor. It was the legal and moral justification for everything that was to come. The final collapse was swift and brutal. With the guilty verdict from the sham trial, Octavia was stripped of her titles and property and officially declared an enemy of the state. The last chance for any intervention, any appeal to justice, was gone. She was now a non-person, a condemned criminal whose life was forfeit. Her sentence was exile. She was first sent to Campania under military guard, a move that still caused public outcry and anxiety among the populace. But this was too close to Rome, too close to the people who loved her. Poppaea, now firmly installed as empress, and terrified of another popular uprising, was not satisfied. She allegedly worked on Nero's fears, arguing that as long as Octavia was on Italian soil, she remained a potential figurehead for a rebellion. A final, more remote location was chosen, the island of Pandateria. This was a place with a dark history, a traditional dumping ground for disgraced members of the imperial family, including Augustus's own daughter, Julia the Elder. To be sent to Pandateria was to be sent to a living tomb. The island was small, barren, and inescapable. Octavia was transported there, accompanied only by a handful of guards. Her collapse was now complete. She had lost her father, her brother, her title, her husband, her home, her reputation, and now her freedom. On that desolate rock, surrounded by the vast, empty sea, she was utterly alone, abandoned by the world. The last, desperate attempts by the Roman people to voice their support had been silenced by the verdict of treason. The Senate, cowed into submission, had ratified her condemnation. There were no more allies, no more protectors. She was left in a state of constant, gnawing terror, knowing that her exile was merely a prelude to the final act. She was a prisoner on an island of the damned, waiting for the inevitable arrival of the ship that would bring her death sentence, Her political and social collapse was absolute, leaving only the physical destruction of her body to be accomplished. The hero's finale came just days after her arrival on the island, a scene of such squalid brutality that it would stain Nero's memory for all time. The official death sentence arrived, carried by the same centurion who now acted as her jailer. The pretext was that the state, fearing she might incite a rebellion using the local fleet, had to eliminate her. It was a transparently absurd justification for a premeditated murder. Octavia, who had endured every humiliation with a quiet, terrified dignity, finally broke. She protested her innocence, no longer as an empress, but as a woman about to be slaughtered. She called out that she was now merely Nero's widow, not his wife, and posed no threat. She invoked their shared ancestry, the name of the Germanici, the sanctity of family, all to no avail. The soldiers bound her. The scene that followed was not a clean, stoic suicide, but a botched and horrifying execution. They opened her veins, but as Tacitus chillingly recounts, her body, already emaciated from grief and terror-stricken, produced only a slow trickle of blood. The process was taking too long. Impatient, the soldiers dragged her to the villa's bathhouse, which they had heated to an extreme temperature. They thrust her into the chamber of hot steam, a common method of suffocation. In the blinding, scalding vapor, her lungs collapsed, and she died. But the final horror was yet to come. Her ordeal was not over, even in death. As a final, ghastly trophy for her rival, her head was severed from her body. It was placed in a container and sent back to Rome. There, it was delivered to the palace and presented to the new empress, Poppaea Sabina. The historical sources state that she looked upon the face of her dead rival. The story that had begun with a political marriage ended with a severed head being delivered as a wedding gift. It was the ultimate act of desecration, a final barbaric confirmation that in Nero's Rome there was no line that could not be crossed, no act of cruelty that could not be surpassed. The legacy of Claudia Octavia is one of the most potent and enduring in Roman history, a testament to the power of martyrdom. In death, the silent and powerless empress gained a voice that has echoed for 2 millennia. Her contemporaries, especially the common people of Rome, saw her as a saint sacrificed to the whims of a monster. Her memory was cherished, and her unjust death became a key article in the long list of crimes that would eventually lead to Nero's own downfall. But her true immortalization came at the hands of the historians and writers who followed. The great historian Tacitus, writing several decades later, made her a central figure in his narrative of Neronian tyranny. In his annals, she is the embodiment of noble innocence, a tragic heroine whose virtue stands in stark contrast to the depravity of Poppaea and the madness of Nero. Suetonius and Cassius Dio further cemented this image. But perhaps the most influential text in the conflict of interpretations was the play Octavia, the only surviving Roman historical drama, long attributed to Seneca, but likely written by a contemporary shortly after Nero's death. In this play, Octavia is the protagonist, a lamenting, tragic figure whose ghost appears to Nero, prophesying his doom. This work transformed her from a historical victim into a literary archetype, the pure woman destroyed by a tyrant, a symbol of the old republican virtues being extinguished by a decadent Oriental-style monarchy. This interpretation has dominated Western culture. She became a recurring figure in operas and plays, always the same character, the blameless, suffering wife. Her legacy is, therefore, a paradox. In life, she was defined by her lineage and her passivity. In death, she became a powerful symbol of resistance to tyranny, her silence amplified into an eternal accusation against the man who murdered her. we can now return to the core question, the central paradox of her story. How did the purest woman of Rome perish because of what the title calls Nero's love? The final comprehensive answer is that she perished not because of his love, but because of his profound and pathological hatred for what she represented. The love mentioned in the title is a deeply ironic and twisted concept. It was not the love of a husband for a wife, but the possessive, narcissistic obsession of a tyrant with a symbol he could neither corrupt nor control. Octavia was a living mirror, and what Nero saw in it drove him to madness. Firstly, her virtue was an intolerable reproach. Every act of piety she performed, every display of public dignity, silently highlighted his own debauchery and lack of gravitas. He was building a new world based on the supremacy of the artist and the gratification of the self, and she was a living monument to the old world of duty and self-restraint. To complete his revolution, he had to tear down its most beloved monument. Secondly, her lineage was a constant threat. Her direct connection to the divine Augustus made his own claim to the throne, which came through adoption and murder, seem tenuous and illegitimate. As long as she lived, she was a reminder of a more authentic, more sacred bloodline. Thirdly, and most fatally, the people's love for her was something he could not tolerate. His ego was so vast that he required total, unconditional adoration. The fact that the Roman people genuinely loved her for her goodness, her ancestry, her suffering, was an unbearable wound to his pride. The riots in her favor proved that she held a power over the people's hearts that he could not command, only demand. He had to destroy her to prove that his will alone mattered, that the people's affections were meaningless. So, he destroyed her systematically. He stripped away her marriage, then her reputation, then her freedom, and finally her life. It was a process of annihilation aimed at erasing the symbol. Her purity was not a shield. It was the very thing that made her a target. She perished because, in the twisted psyche of Nero, the only way to escape the reflection of his own monstrousness was to shatter the mirror. The universal lesson of Claudia Octavia's life is a chilling and timeless verdict from history on the nature of absolute power. Her story demonstrates, with brutal clarity, that unchecked authority does not simply corrupt, it creates its own insane reality, a universe in which truth, virtue, and innocence become capital crimes. The tragedy is not just that of a good woman destroyed by a bad man, but of a political system so broken that it empowers madness and then systematically devours its own symbols of legitimacy. Octavia's fate reveals the profound fragility of virtue when it is confronted by power that has detached itself from all moral and legal constraints. Her goodness was not a force for change. It was a passive quality that made her a more satisfying victim. Her story is a testament to the fact that in a tyrannical system, to be loved by the people is to be hated by the ruler, and to be a symbol of a better past is to have no future. It is a lesson about the clash, not just of personalities, but of worldviews. The stoic, ordered world of tradition versus the chaotic, narcissistic world of the transgressive individual. Nero, the ultimate individualist, saw all of history, tradition, and morality as a mere stage for his personal drama. Octavia, who lived by the rules, was destroyed by the man who believed he was above them. The final verdict of history is that any state or system that places the whim of a single individual above the rule of law and the consent of the governed will inevitably begin to consume itself, and its first victims will always be the best and most honorable people within it. Octavia was the first, most noble casualty of the moral plague that was Nero's reign, a plague that would eventually consume his favorites, his city, and finally, himself. The final frame is not the moment of her death, but the moment of her rival's triumph, a quiet, chilling scene in the heart of the Roman palace. Poppaea Sabina, now the undisputed empress of Rome, sits in her chambers. A heavy, sealed box is brought before her. It is opened, and inside rests the severed head of Claudia Octavia. There is no historical record of Poppaea's expression, but we can imagine it. A calm, perhaps curious gaze upon the face of the woman who had stood between her and ultimate power. This is the final image, the silent trophy. The air in the room is thick with the scent of expensive perfumes, but it cannot mask the stench of murder. This is the culmination of years of ambition, seduction, and whispered poison. In this silent tableau, vice has triumphed completely over virtue. The modest, pious empress has been butchered and her head delivered like a piece of tribute, while the ruthless, immoral courtesan now wears her crown. This image is the true legacy of Nero's reign, a world turned upside down, where the most sacred traditions are desecrated and the most horrific crimes are celebrated as victories. The shadow of this silent trophy would hang over the rest of Poppaea's short life and Nero's disastrous reign. It was a victory that cost them their humanity and would ultimately cost them everything else, an act of such profound darkness that it would forever define their place in history, a final, horrifying testament to how innocence was sacrificed to madness. 175.1